Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 34, Maura and The Spire. In order for the podcast to continue, I really need more guests to volunteer to be on the show. So if you're interested, or if you know someone who is interested, please go to gocorral.com/SDS to learn more about how to apply to be on the show. That's GOCORRAL.com/SDS. Today I'm here with Maura. Hi, Maura.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about your campaign, Spire, The City Must Fall. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you who you are outside of the game.
Yeah, so my day job is a librarian. I'm an adult programming coordinator, which means I run all of the fun late night stuff over at the library. And I've been playing RPGs since I was about 8 or 9. I inherited my mom's D&D books and the campaign she used to play with my granddad, and all of his minis as well, which I still have, and all of the old character sheets from AD&D. So the first campaigns we played were on those awful, like, class-specific character sheets.
Right, the ones where you couldn't change the race either.
Yeah, you had to or the races were stat locked, so you had to have like a 16 dexterity in order to play an elf or something like that.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was my childhood. And then I started playing 3.5 with a group at the library where I was living at the time. And that was a bit of a culture shock, because I went from living in rural Texas to my dad took a job with the army on a base in Germany. So
wow.
we a bit of a culture shift, and we hung out with all of the military kids on base. And vastly different experiences. You know, we'd always done some traveling, but Texas is so big, you can drive for 3 days and still be in Texas.
Yeah.
And then you go to Europe and you can drive for 3 hours and be in a different country with
Right.
a different language. So that was definitely very formative. I ended up playing every week. We would go over there Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. We would be at this guy's house.
Long.
Yeah, it was a long day. So we had lunch and dinner over there, and we would just be playing all kinds of RPGs. You know, a lot of D&D, of course, but we played Pathfinder, we played Shadowrun, we played whatever weird homebrew the guy had cooked up recently. That was also, I realize now, really rare to have a group that met that consistently for that long. For 3 years I was in that group, and really just gave me a sense of how welcoming D&D could be and RPGs could be as the weird nerd kid.
Yeah, I feel like D&D kind of attracts theater kids a lot, and it ends up being supporting the same type of people that find support in those groups as well, and end up being very welcoming because they're more aware of the roles that people play.
I watched the theater kids go by, but yeah, I was a band kid. I was the introvert.
Okay.
D&D, that group provided me some real friendships that I did not have at school. So that was really great. And then I became an adult. I went to college. I evangelized Dungeons and Dragons wherever I went. Became a forever GM. And I run this campaign now for Spire. So Spire is the setting. My campaign is called Her Dark Administrations. I decided to jump into the actual play podcast world because no one else was doing a podcast for Spire.
Yeah, it's a pretty small. I mean, it looks very interesting. I took a look at the rules when I saw what you were playing. It looks really interesting, but yeah, it does seem like it's a smaller reach than a lot of other games.
Yeah, definitely. It's a UK game company. I wouldn't say very indie. Like they've run Spire was kickstarted, I think back in 2011, something like that, and they've done a couple of Kickstarters for games since then. But that's like their main method still of launching games is through backer kit and Kickstarter. So definitely not a big publisher.
I think that's starting to become the norm, actually, for a lot of publishers. So, like, so Spire seems very similar to Blades in the Dark, right? And Blades in the Dark was done through a Kickstarter.
That's true. Yeah, and that launched a whole engine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they still do Kickstarter projects that way. It's just they don't necessarily need to, but they will, just to sort of gauge interest for how much they should print, almost.
Yeah, well, and it's an alternate form of investment, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
creates this kind of player buy-in that you don't need a tech bro basically to come in and say, "Yeah, this seems good. I'll throw money at this until it works."
Right, right.
Which probably I has mixed feelings about it. Like I love the idea of like the community funded, but there's a certain amount of like pay to play anyway, where it's like, well, if you have the connections and you have enough clicks, then even a really terrible game can go viral. And you can't ever predict how that'll happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think people that repeatedly fund stuff on Kickstarter, there's always someone that's had a bad experience like that, where there is something you fund that ends up being like not really worth it.
Yeah, or not coming out at all. Although Kickstarter has gotten a lot better than the early days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
But Spire has done really well. I love every game that the company Rowan Rook and Deckard has put out.
One of the cool things I thought from like that just like screams indie game to me was that it was printed in Latvia,
Yeah,
the physical product.
they recently came out with a fifth edition version.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure where it's printed, but it
I mean
includes.
like D&D 5th edition for Spire?
No. So the for Spire, it's the fifth anniversary edition. So
Oh, okay.
that's I guess it must have been more recently that it because the fifth anniversary just happened last year. Spire must have been printed in 2018. That's way later than I thought. The pandemic has completely skewed my sense of time.
I know. Yeah.
I have no idea what year anything happened.
Okay, well, whatever. And anniversary edition, no matter how much it was.
Contains some supplements, has different end papers, is really cool. And that is not the one I have. But there's and like there's a huge Italian gaming population for Spire,
Wow, okay.
which I would never have thought of, but I'm in the games company Discord, and there's a lot of European players, which makes sense. The game is published in Britain.
I guess there's some like pockets for the European gaming environment that I don't not necessarily aware of. Like Dark Eye in Germany is one of the ones that I feel like I know more about. So that's just one that I wouldn't have expected this game to catch on in Italy particularly.
Yeah, there's they've tested a couple of like convention mega games, which I'm so jealous that I couldn't go to. But it's the kind of thing where you get 30 people in a room and everyone's at it. Like there's 7 people at a different table and they're running their own missions, and then there's one central table where you can come and affect the main mission. It's like a kind of experience.
Okay, so it ends up being like sort of like here's the basilica at that table, kind of, or is it not cool?
Yeah, so everybody else is like doing a facet of the job or the mission, and then there's like the main event that people are coming and going from, and like paths are crossing between the different tables as well.
That's really cool. It feels like you would sort of have to be more loose on how much time is passing between different situations, but
yeah. One of the things I really like about Spire is how flexible the rules are. And like the rules give players an incredible amount of power, which can be frightening as a GM, but I have found it very freeing as well. As a forever GM, I have been doing the work, pulling the world up by its bootstraps for years now, and to be given the freedom to say, okay, well, you tell me what this bar is like. You tell me who the NPC is that you find, has been really, really relaxing and engaging with the right group, of course.
I think that's something that like narrative first games like Spire and Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark and all those ones kind of encourage. But I also feel like it's something that you can easily do in other games as well. It's just people kind of forget or don't realize that they can do it.
Yeah, the not realizing, I mean, it really takes an experienced group to be comfortable doing that, even if you're theoretically aware it's possible. So I'm lucky enough to have been settled in one place for a couple of years now and to have had a regular group that, again, I took from playing their first time playing D&D, their first time playing any RPG ever, to playing all these weird niche indie games.
Nice. Well, that's great to have a long-term group like that.
Yeah.
I have the same. I'm playing with the same people I was playing when I was 10 years old.
Yeah. Gosh.
Well, for Spire, I feel like how I wanted to do it was like rules first, and then the setting, and then kind of how you're using like the official setting, but obviously there are differences between how you're presenting it. So I wanted to get more into your interpretation after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So rules first. How about you tell us the rules for Spire?
Okay, so broad strokes. The idea of what is called the Resistance Toolkit, which is their kind of setting neutral kit of rules, is that there are character archetypes very similar to Powered by the Apocalypse, where like you'll select a playbook from a set, and you'll be given. You can choose from a set of moves, and they're called advances. So you have low advances, high, medium advances, and high advances. And you progress your character by changing the city. There's no experience points. Leveling up just means making bold moves. And so if you, at the very beginning of the game, decide you're going to go assassinate one of the city council members, and you succeed, key point there, through sheer dumb luck, you can get a high advance your second or third session of the game. But it's much more likely that you're just going to die because the system is pretty brutal as far as health and damage goes.
Yeah, it was something I noticed.
Yeah, and it's kind of meant to be that way. Like, one of the introductory statements of the book says, you are going to die doing this. The game, you're not really meant to succeed. The game is about a group or a cell of dark elf revolutionaries, some might call them terrorists, who are attempting to overthrow the High Elf or Aelfir society. The Aelfir have colonized the Spire for the past few hundred years, kind of nebulously, and have like instituted themselves as a ruling class.
That was something that was interesting to me, like the timing of it, because they're like most of the people in the setting are elves. So there's this like, how much memory do they have of these past events? Like elves in D&D live for like 500 years, and other settings live forever. So like, there's all these people that would presumably remember not being oppressed subjects of the High Elves. So
in quote unquote, in the book canon, they like to say no canon Spire. So in the book, the elves have human-ish lifespans, like 100 years max. In my version of the Spire, it's more like 200. Not nearly as long as D&D elves, or even as some of the like other high fantasy elves that we've seen. Long enough that some of the like vulnerable elders of the society would remember when the Drow ruled Spire, but it's like one generation removed.
Okay, yeah, I guess that does answer that question.
I mean, it's a game about colonialism. It's a game about oppression. It's a cathartic game because you, as a player character, inherently have a lot of power over your surroundings, both from the GM standpoint and from the character standpoint.
Uh-huh.
And you, as a player character, are inherently a lot hardier than like the NPCs usually have 3 to 5 health on what's called a resistance track. And the players have 5 different resistance tracks that measures things like wealth, like physical health, but also your reputation, how the community perceives you. And there's one called Shadow, which measures how aware the like ruling order is of your character. So the fact that reputation is different than Shadow, it has always been really interesting to me.
Well, it's like the reputation of the public versus the government.
Yeah. It's like you're it's Al Capone versus you have this wanted list that's a mile long, but until you are turned out by the community, you are not going to get arrested. And then the last one is mind. So that plays into the part of Spire that is all about occultism and really weird magics, unsettling body horror, which they get into more in sister game of the Spire, which is called Heart.
Uh-huh.
So it's the names of the tracks are Blood, Shadow, Reputation, Silver, and Mind. And so you can have like an armored tank character with 7 basically free spots in Blood, but they have no resistance in Silver. So they go to try and buy something. I ask for a roll, and all of a sudden, like, they are still suffering the consequences of their actions. And that is done through a 2-tiered system called Stress and Fallout. And Stress by itself doesn't actually do anything. If you fail a roll, or if you roll a mixed success, you are going to take stress. And there are a couple different dice sizes. So it's like you can take a D4 of stress, a D6 of stress, a D8 of stress.
Yeah, this is the part that seemed like, oh, this is exactly the same as Blades and the Dark.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very similar, like, hyper-urban setting with, like, this dark magic atmosphere to it, where you're trying to, like, undercut the big government people. And then it also has stress as a resource.
Yeah. Yes, it would be very easy for me if I was writing a game with the Resistance Toolkit to say, okay, well, these are the stress tracks I want. These are the things that I want the characters to care about as far as, like, health goes. But the fallouts are all also very setting specific. And so what happens is you build up to a certain amount of stress, and every time you add to your stress track, I roll a d10. And if I roll at or under the amount of stress that you currently have, you suffer fallout. And so again, it's minor, medium, or major fallout. And you remove a different amount of stress from the track, depending on how severe the fallout is.
Right. So say I've got, like, 6 stress and as I remember, this is, like, split between the
Each
different...
tracks have different, fallouts. Yep.
Right. So I've got, say, 2 stress in Blood, 3 in Mind, and I get 1 more in Silver.
Mm-hmm.
So then you make a fallout roll, right? And if you get 6 or under, because I have 6 total, 2 plus 3 plus 1, then I suffer a fallout.
Yes, and you would, at that point, suffer a medium fallout. Now, that's, again, that's the way that the book does it. In my game, I prefer to go with a track-specific fallout, which makes the characters a little bit more durable.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I would only be rolling against the 1 fallout, or the 1 stress that you had in Silver, and I wouldn't care that you had stress in other tracks.
Okay, so I'd only suffer fallout in that circumstance if you rolled a 1 or less.
Exactly, yeah.
And it would be a minor fallout, not a medium fallout.
Yep. Now, the downside to that is that usually you get to remove 3 stress from a track when you suffer minor fallout. But because I've locked the tracks, you can only remove that 1 stress to Silver, and the other 2 get wasted.
Right.
And there's a couple of different source books for Spire that each contain different fallouts. I mean, some that are scenario specific to the short adventures that have been published, So what I did is I collated a spreadsheet that has all of the fallouts from all of the books, and so
Oh my god.
there's fallout.
Have you shared that with anyone? I feel like the Spire community would probably really appreciate that.
They would, and I really did think about it, but the fact of the matter is that this is like creative writing. That is, if somebody wanted access to the fallouts in Strata, they would normally have to buy the Strata book.
Right.
And I don't really feel comfortable sharing what's basically written material that I haven't written.
I guess I assumed this part with the permission of the writers. I feel like that's not something that necessarily is going to, from my perspective as a writer, wouldn't prevent people from buying those books if they were interested. Like, people aren't buying the books just to get more Fallout things, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's something I would feel comfortable asking in the Discord about. It's a kind of a gray area for me.
No, I definitely see what you're talking about there. Yeah, you don't want to share someone else's material that they're selling for free. That's definitely not something you want to do.
Yeah, but I do like that I've collected it, and I'm very proud of my spreadsheet skills. I have collapsible menus.
Beautiful.
Librarian things.
Right.
So that's Stress and Fallout. I haven't really touched on the advances. Those are also super class specific. So one of the real places that I think Spire shines as a system, that also makes it very difficult if I wanted to write something in the set, using the rule set, is that all of the moves are so very specific to each character and class. And the classes include being full of bees. You can be a drunken knight with like gang chivalry as your main word. You can be a spider midwife, who is the closest the Spire gets to a healing class, but which mostly just takes the damage for other people.
Yeah, you're absorbing it, not really removing it.
Exactly. You can be a moon priest. You can be a cannibal priest who has a hyena for a companion. You can be an artist who just uses occult magics to make parties happen wherever they want.
I don't think that one was in the quick start rules. That's funny.
That's the idol.
Oh, that was okay. Yeah,
yes.
I guess it had a different presentation within the quick start rules for what it was.
And so the classes are just they instantly grab you in a way that I've played a couple of different Powered by the Apocalypse games, and I've been vaguely interested in some of the playbooks, but each of the moves in Spire is so evocative. Like the knight has one where you can literally just name a pub and say what they serve there. The Vermisian Sage has one where you can create a backdoor into train hell and push someone through it.
Yeah, I thought that one was really interesting. And it still works within the lore, because like the subway system is
Cursed.
Everywhere, but also cursed.
Yes. Yeah. And then one of the classes in one of the expansion books is the Inksmith, which is literally a noir detective, or like a noir journalist who has the power to literally rewrite reality in their stories.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I did feel like a decent number of these did feel like very familiar to other, like...
Yes, and a very much a mishmash of tropes and settings.
Yeah. So the like you were talking about what the advances are, and they are like tied to the different archetype classes, but like they still can feel familiar. Like the knight one doesn't just have the drinking thing; they also have like sort of an absorb damage power that.
Yeah.
If you play D&D, like barbarians get that. Like that's sort of what that does.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of touch points, both narratively and mechanically. Like if you want to play a wizard, you would play a Vermisian Sage because
Mhm.
they are very much the like not just the researchers of Spire, but also the people who are most likely to be able to get down and study something and discover that they can manipulate it in a way.
Yeah, it does feel interesting though that it makes like just the practice of magic is dangerous.
Yes. So the only difference between divine magic and occult magic is that divine magic always works. When you cast a divine spell, you simply mark stress and it happens. You still have to mark stress to do it. But when you are casting an occult spell, you have to roll. And usually the advance will tell you what the roll is. And then there's a chance that it will fail and the spell won't go off at all and you'll still take stress.
Well, there's a chance you won't take stress though.
That's true. There's a chance you won't take any stress at all. And what I find really interesting is that some of the quote unquote priest classes, such as the midwife, are occult. All of their advances have the occult tag, which means that although like they are clerics in a way, they're priests. Something about the setting and it, like in my version of Spire, the spider goddess Ishkra simply doesn't have enough worshippers to make the spells reliable.
Mm-hmm. So they still have to sort of pour more of themselves into making the magic work instead of relying on sort of her making the magic work is the idea.
Yes, yeah. So look, you mentioned. Well, let's hold off because there's one more thing I want to talk about mechanically before we get into narrative world building stuff, and I want to talk about how to roll dice in Spire.
Yes.
And so it is a D10 system where you have a pool of dice. There are a list of skills. There are about 8 to 10 skills, and a list of domains. And so when I, the GM, ask for a roll, I'm going to ask for a skill and a domain that really roughly matches up to what you're trying to do. And then the player is going to have 1 die for the base, 1 die for the skill, if they have it, and 1 die for the domain. And then they can also gain an extra die through what's called mastery. And mastery is conveyed a couple of different ways. Like you can have a knack in a skill or a domain, which is basically a knack is like a narrower version of the skill. So let's say you have the high society domain, and if you have it twice in character creation, like you have a background that gives you high society, and then you also have an advance that gives you high society, you will develop a knack in that. So one of my players is an idol who had a knack with dealing with high society artsy types.
Okay.
So then they'll gain an extra dice when that specific scenario comes up. You'll roll all 4 dice and take the highest. A 8, 9, or 10 is a complete success. A 6 or a 7 is a mixed success. 1 through 5 is a failure. And then so there's 1, which is a crit fail. You take double stress. And 10 is a crit success. Something extra good happens.
Right. And the mixed success is usually like you're taking stress but still achieving what you were trying to do.
Yes, and I find that a little bit easier than some of, like, I've played Wild Sea, where if you get, like, doubles on the roll, you have a twist. I find it easier to deal mechanically with it, where it's like, you're going to take this stress, and here's a number that I throw at you. But you still get what you want, and so I can narrate the thing that, the success that happens without worrying how I'm going to make you pay for it narratively. Like, the paying for it is mechanical, and that's done, and I don't need to worry about it anymore.
Right. I feel like the system did sort of give you permission to do, like, narrative consequences instead if you wanted to. But I feel like the stress system kind of already has that baked in.
Yeah, and it's possible, I mean, it gets really interesting when they succeed on a roll, but they still take fallout, because fallout is also narrative.
Right.
So they get what they want, but something concrete bad happens to them. And if you're doing fallout the way that the book tells you to do it, then you can have all of this stress in blood, and you take a blood fallout, but you succeeded on a roll where that doesn't, like, you're not trying to physically hammer anything.
Mhm.
So then it can be really interesting to try and work that into the narrative, where it's like, okay, well, your leg doesn't suddenly break, but maybe you're walking up the stairs and you twist your ankle wrong. So even though you do succeed in convincing the bailiff to let you in, your leg is now broken. Mechanically, that's the fallout that you have.
Mhm.
So it can be challenging sometimes still.
Yeah, I was curious, like, how you would split that kind of stuff up, but with the doing track specific stress and fallout, then you kind of you don't have to deal with that anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So you have masteries. I think the only other thing that you left out for how you get more dice is help.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's kind of self-explanatory. If you have someone helping you, you get an extra die.
You get an extra dice. Now, the fun thing for Spire is that if you then still fail, or if you still roll a mixed success, the person who helped you will also take stress.
Right. But the hope is that them helping you means that you're less likely to get that.
Yeah, and you are less likely to take any stress at all. But I mean, I've had someone roll like triple ones on a roll. And so not only they suffered double stress for the roll and bad things happened, but the person that they were with also suffered that double stress. And the person they were with is the one who took the fallout. But the person who made the roll didn't. So the help, that stress mechanic definitely makes the help action a little bit spicier.
One of the other things I thought was interesting was specifically like the bleeding condition for how it interacted with that.
Yeah.
Because that's like a minor fallout is your character is bleeding now, and you take one more blood stress every action you take.
Yeah. Some of the minor fallouts are really mean. In the first episode of my podcast, one of the characters gets a minor fallout in which they cannot gain dice from a domain, any domain at all.
Oh, wow.
So that we've cut a dice from their pool, period, until the end of the situation. And I think they ended up dying at the end of that situation. Like, they did not make it.
Wow. I mean, I guess for one situation, that kind of is like, okay, but geez.
Yeah, and it's really meant to be, okay, well, this is maybe the next two rolls. But the party had decided they wanted to split up. And so in the process of trying to further the mission on their own, like, they were the only one able to make the rolls. And they were not able to, like, get out of the scene and quiet themselves down. And, like, I think the name of the fallout is Shaken. So if they had been able to take a moment in a quiet space and relax, I would have removed the fallout. But they never did. They decided to climb out of a window and try to get into the big bad evil guy's office. Again, by themselves. So, narrative choices there. And, I mean, I love the way that it played out. And, like, so that it is kind of difficult to kill characters in Spire. I've had characters suffer 3 or 4 severe fallouts without dying. It just becomes increasingly difficult to play your character.
Yes, it did feel like the severe fallouts aren't quite death, but they are...
The fallout that is, you are literally dying, gives you a way out. The fallout says you can choose to die, or you can lose something important to you and cling on to life. So there is a lot of player agency in that as well.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. A lot of narrative-focused games do have, like, death is something that the player chooses for their character when they're in that situation.
Yeah.
I mean, you could do something else, like, instead of your character dying, like, they like, in a sort of blood stress case, then they lose a limb, or they go blind, or something like that.
Yeah. Some of the other fallouts, like the shadow fallout, is you are betrayed by your ministry bosses, and you've basically been turned over to the city guard. You aren't caught, but you know that you are about to be caught.
Right.
One of the other ones is the reputation one is you are exiled from the Spire forever. You have to, like, you're not dead, but you have to leave and you have to take yourself out of the narrative.
Yeah, and those ones are essentially, I mean, not quite character death because you can sort of say goodbye, but you're only getting like 1 or 2 more sessions before sort of
absolutely.
narratively you're gone.
What's meant to key into is like 1 or 2 more sessions, and then like don't, and I say this to my players all the time, don't get precious about your characters. You have to think of them as narrative arcs that are going to wrap up, and you are going to bring someone else in, and we are going to continue the story.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's different than Blades in the Dark, because it has a pretty lethal system as well, but there is like a specific mechanic within Blades for your character, like retiring and going off to live a happy life with all the money they've gained.
Spire not so much.
Yeah, that's just not the case here. It's like you struggle until you die, and
then someone else picks up the torch.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and realistically, your characters never fully succeed at what they're trying to do.
Yes, I mean, even if in the bizarre case that you do succeed in bringing down the Aelfir regime, like that's the end of the story. Spire doesn't have the tools to go any further than that. I've seen people pick up different games to fill in the gap. Like someone that I saw on the Discord played a campaign of Spire and then picked up the Quiet Year to find out what happened to the Spire in the year after the overthrow of the Aelfir regime. But it's impossible to do within the setting as written.
Yeah, I mean, and in some case, like, it's just, you run this campaign and, mission accomplished, the campaign is over, let's go do a different game now, guys.
Yeah, Spire lends itself super well to, I mean, campaigns are meant to be pretty short. I think the book says they should be 3 to 12 sessions. Mine has gone on much longer than that. I think I'm on session 24. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through.
What's the average number of characters people have had, though?
That's true. So we've just brought in literally everyone is playing a different character than they started with.
Yeah.
For various reasons, but I've only hard killed one person.
Hard killed. How many have you soft killed?
Many of them. Actually, so the player that I mentioned in the very first episode, they died. And they chose, instead of clinging on to life, they chose to do one last dramatic entrance and literally like changed the course of the session, allowed the other characters to escape the consequences for their actions and fulfill the mission successfully. And then I brought them back to life as a living plant zombie of the Spire.
Oh, of course.
And there is a kind of a subclass called the Druids of the Living Spire, who basically believe the Spire is a living organism, and we are they are ants within its body. And their purpose is to kind of serve this greater mind. And whether or not the mind existed before they started worshipping it, it definitely exists now.
That's right. Yeah, you talked about how the gods derive power from their worshippers. So if there's someone worshipping something, then that thing then exists and derives power from that. Exactly.
So there are several kind of like main gods who have amassed thousands, if not millions, of worshippers. And so their identities are pretty set. They don't change from shrine to shrine or person to person. But there are, in Spire, like many, many smaller gods. There's an entire district called Pilgrim's Walk, which is just stuffed with churches, each competing for a handful of parishioners. And if you're playing one kind of Spire, they're like competing for the meager wages and tithing coins of these poor people who are coming to the Spire in search of faith. But in another world, and much closer, like in my world, they are literally competing for the faith and belief of the most people so that the gods that they are worshiping can become more real. And the more real you are, the more miracles you can perform, the more worshippers you will get. So it's a kind of like locked in spiral. And like one of the other things I love about Spire is that you can play many different kinds of games, even within this one city. You can play a hard-boiled detective game. You can play a like 1920s espionage. I have chosen to go much more the occult route and like play with this weird magic and these gods and this belief. But you can pretty much ignore all of that if you want and say, yeah, the gods exist, but they're not impactful to the Spire at all. It's all like everything's hollow. Everyone's faith is hollow, and the church is like stealing your money.
I guess the question I had about that is do the gods have any other motivation besides getting more worshippers? Like, do they have any sort of hobbies outside of the rat race?
So it depends on the god. In my Spire, there is a very specific thing that the gods are seeking in Spire. But that has not been made clear to the main characters. But like the Spire, no one knows what or who built the Spire. This is this mile-high city. It wasn't built by the Drow who used to rule it. It wasn't built by the Aelfir. The humans who are experts in exploring these ruined arcologies from ancient beings they call the Prokatoas. Spire wasn't built by them either. Spire doesn't look like any other arcology in the world.
I'm getting sort of a Mass Effect vibe here.
Yeah, a bit. But at the end of the day, in my Spire, there were beings who became extra-dimensional. Blink, like Flatland, you can see in 3 dimensions, I can see in 4. And the shape of things is different. Because there are these demons that exist within the world that the only thing we know about them is they are universally not banned, but like shunned. And whenever a demonic incursion happens, it's like a nuclear bomb going off. The rules of physics cease to apply. There is no light. There is no sound. Things are dismembered, melted, turned upside down, and then it vanishes.
The demon, or like the portal that creates that problem?
The portal vanishes. The demon is gone, and what is left is like slag.
Okay.
And some people make drugs out of it, but
that was a part that we missed earlier in the description. There's a lot of drugs in the Spire, like
yes,
lower stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important to that kind of like hyper urban, like downtrodden campaign. It's like we've got a whole list of different kinds of drugs that you can take, but we're a little bit wiggly on how much you get paid.
Right.
In my Spire, demons are beings who once existed in the world and used the Spire as a lightning rod to draw down some kind of celestial/magical event and make themselves into demons.
Okay.
This happened probably thousands of years ago. No one remembers it, but the gods are very interested in controlling Spire because the event is going to happen again very soon.
Okay, so it sounded like sort of stolen fire, kind of, is the idea there? Like they stole from the gods and they're trying to stop it from happening again?
Not exactly. It's more like the gods were jealous. Because the gods didn't exist because no one worshipped these gods at the time the demons became demons.
Okay, so there isn't some, like, broader, like, identity as a god. It's more...
Yeah, there is no true, like, core pantheon. I mean, the gods are made by humanoid and, like, intelligent belief.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the opposite of animism. Like the idea that everything inherently has a spirit. No. The idea that everything is inherently magical, yes, but it's only when someone sees that magical effect and ascribes it to a god. It's more like it's not Schrodinger. It's what's the quantum entanglement? The idea that if you observe a thing, it becomes different.
That is Schrodinger.
That is true. All I could think of was the cat.
Yeah, I mean, the cat is a representation of that until you observe it, you don't know which state it's in.
I see. Yes. So it's the idea that the world is in a state of flux until you observe it, until intelligent life observes it, and then it becomes divine. Literally.
The pattern that you have subscribed to it becomes the reality of what it is.
Exactly.
Okay. So I guess what I was trying to get at there was like there's older gods that have like fallen out of fashion and no longer are worshipped.
Yes.
And presumably those gods were able to talk to the newer gods before they died and pass on some sort of knowledge. Is that something that occurs or does not occur within your conception of this story?
I am sure that it does. There are definitely older gods who have fallen out of favor and become less powerful. And I am sure, like, there is a kind of, like, god-to-god communication that passes beyond the realm of mortals.
Mm-hmm.
There are also, like, literally heavens / alternate or pocket. I think they're more like pocket dimensions.
Okay.
That people can physically get to. More of a, like, older Greek god kind of, I can physically go to Mount Olympus and see the gods.
Right.
I can physically go to the moon and speak to the goddess there.
Right, the moon goddess.
Does that make sense? No, but because you believe it exists, it is now the moon.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think as far as the ascension stuff goes, the gods aren't looking to prevent another ascension, they're looking to take it for themselves. The idea that they have, which may or may not be accurate, but the idea that the gods are working under right now is that if they can harness the energy of this lightning rod of the spire, they can become fully real and make themselves bedrock of the world.
Okay.
And no longer be dependent on their worshippers.
Okay.
This is a very attractive idea to something as ephemeral as a god, no matter how powerful or less powerful they are.
Mm-hmm.
So the player characters are moving on this battlefield where there's like 3 or 4 at least different pantheons who are sending mortal champions to try and take control of the spire because they cannot yet move in and of themselves to take it.
Okay, so this is kind of like gods trying to become immortal in their own conception of what that means compared to how mortals perceive them.
Yep.
And I see this is how you're introducing the humans and the gnolls to your campaign, because I didn't see those in the source material.
Yes, so the humans are, I mean, when you're playing Spire, you are playing as a drow revolutionary. That's kind of it.
Right.
The humans and the gnolls. So the gnolls are currently at war with the Aelfir. You won't find one walking the streets of Spire openly. They do exist in some like very specific places, mostly prison, and a very small outpost in the North Docks, which is where the knights hang out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a floating garbage patch called the Heap that canonically has a small gnoll research outpost.
Okay, so these are in the canon Spire setting, yes. Then.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess they just weren't in the quick start rules I was reading.
Yeah, not in the quick start, and they're not really they're not playable, so it's kind of just flavoring. The humans are a little bit more respected. They're called retro engineers, and they specialize in this like ancient tech. And so they have like a whole university set up in one of the upper echelons of Spire, specifically to study old technology there. Neither of them are super religious, though, which is very interesting. The gnolls have mastered a kind of demonology that allows them to control demons and create machinery powered by this extra dimensional nuclear fusion, basically.
Uh-huh.
And the war has not been going super well for the Aelfir. So the Gnolls are interested in Spire as a scientific advancement. And coming at it from a different place, so are humans.
This is a very different take on gnolls than what I'm used to from the D&D representation of them.
Oh, yes.
Basically just being, cannibals.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know, everything in this book is a complete subversion, except maybe the humans. They're kind of just chilling off in the corner. But the evil high elves of this porcelain perfection come and take over the completely normal workaday dark elves who are just living in the Spire. Not a take you would normally see in a D&D book.
I feel like it would work within Forgotten Realms for that representation. It just wouldn't work with our current, in current events for Forgotten Realms, for example. Because there's a period of Forgotten Realms history where the Dark Elves and the High Elves and the Wood Elves were all on the surface and fighting each other in wars over stuff like this.
Yeah.
And it easily could fit into the Forgotten Realms setting during that period. But yeah, during the sort of canon version of Faerûn now, no, totally not. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's sort of aesthetically that way because they're still have the spider thing and all of the dark mistress goddess, but
yeah, so the spider goddess and the dark moon goddess being two separate people. And also, I mean, the drow are still affected by the quote-unquote curse. It literally hurts you to be out in the sunlight.
Oh, that's right. Forgot about that part.
But nobody knows why, and so there's a bunch of different myths talking about it. And so the Aelfir are well, you are cursed, and we are blessed because we can walk in the sun. And the drow are kind of well, you can't see in the dark, so who's really winning here?
Right.
But yes, the Gnoll society is definitely very interesting, and we don't know much about it in Canon Spire, except that they are very scientifically advanced, and they have technology that is not seen outside of their country in Far Nujab, and that the Aelfir are at war with them. That's kind of all we know.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that was one of the other questions I was going to ask is, can you play something besides a Dark Elf within your representation of Spire? And it sounds like the answer to that is no.
No. Again, it's so setting specific. Spire is trying to tell. I mean, in some ways it's open in the genre of story it's trying to tell, but the kind of story it's trying to tell is so specific to the Drow and to their liberation struggle that you really can't play anything other than a Drow. If you wanted to, there's the sister game Heart, where you delve into the wound in reality underneath the Spire, which we also talked about.
Yeah.
And in there you can play a human, a high elf, drow, gnoll, it doesn't really matter. But also in that game, it's the politics are not what Heart is about. Heart is about delving into dungeons of unreality and carving through meat space into no, I mean there's nothing really good in the Heart, but something valuable.
Okay, yeah, that does feel like a very different
it's a very
game.
different vibe. There is a book called Vermisian Black Ops, which is literally how to convert your Spire character into a Heart character and vice versa.
Okay. All right, so they do sort of have that idea.
Yeah, so the games kind of touch but don't overlap very much.
Mm-hmm.
The other big thing is that the Heart is what powers the Vermisian. So the Vermisian is the cursed subway network. It extends all throughout the Spire. There are stations where you can go and step into the Vermisian from real space. But the Vermisian sages also have these back doors that they can find the space of the Vermisian wherever they are. And that was created by some very misguided Aelfir engineer who decided it would be great to tap into this wound in reality in order to power his subway trains.
Is there anything really different than that and like using nuclear power for something?
Right, yes.
So much potential for something going wrong.
And so little advantage to doing it right.
Yeah. Okay, let's get more into the setting. So Spire is like a giant tower
Yes.
that's, unfathomably high. It's as high as the plot requires it to be.
Yep, exactly.
That is not just like a skyscraper, it's more like an entire city wide almost. Is that the right type of scale for it?
Yeah. In my spire, each level is the size of like a mid-sized city.
Mhm.
And so you can walk between places and like walk between levels relatively easily, but like it takes half a day to get from ground level up to the center of the spire, for example.
Right. And there's not elevators because that's part of that.
There are actually elevators.
Oh, okay.
They're just more expensive. So in my spire, what we do is if you have time and you want to take the stairs, there's no plot reason for you not to do that for free. But if you want to ride the elevators, if you have to get somewhere narratively like important, then you're gonna have to make a roll. And you could take stress, which is probably gonna be silver stress because you have to pay for transport.
Right, yeah. Or you could do reputation or shadow or something if you're sneaking
Absolutely.
on or you're getting a friend to pay for you.
It's very flexible. So there are also bond mechanics. You start the game, each character class has NPC bonds that they start with that they get to describe.
The hidden stress track.
Yes. And you can ask your bonds to do things for you. But they usually only get 1 or 2 dice to do it. And if they fail, then they take stress and they can be dragged out into the street and shot.
Or they betray you.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So you can ask your friends to do stuff for you, but it is inherently dangerous both to them and to you. It also depends on how ruthless you want to be as a player.
Yeah. I was recognizing that in the rules you can get something good out of a bond if you're willing to basically burn it to the ground.
Yep.
And but then the bond is gone. You don't get to use it again.
And you can also create new bonds by kind of RPing through an interaction or repeatedly visiting a character who you keep asking to do stuff for you. They can become a bond if you do stuff for them.
Right.
You can also so there are 3 levels of bonds. You can make an individual bond. You can make a street level bond. So like you're friends with one gang on the corner. Or you can make a city level bond where like you have an in with the Ladderers Guild or the Elevator Guild, and they know you to look at you anywhere you go in Aspire. You get on an elevator for free.
Yeah. I feel like that's another part of what the system encourages is like you only roll dice when there's a reason to. So if you have like this narrative bond with the Elevator Guild, then you don't need to roll to use the elevator. You just get to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. But you would, like, as a GM, I would expect you to have to do something pretty intense for that guild as a whole before I'll give that bond to you. Like, if you save one elevator guy's life, great, you have an individual level bond. If that guy's on shift that day on that district, you can walk in, no problem.
Mm.
But if you want to make a friend at that whole level of the Spire, then you're going to have to do something for that group. And then if you want to do something for the entire guild, you're going to have to go talk to leadership. You're going to have to get a lot of bureaucracy involved. There's probably going to be at least an entire session devoted to you negotiating whatever you want with the Elevators Guild and whatever you're going to do for them, what job you're going to do for them. And so that can spin out into a whole side quest.
Yeah, definitely. It does seem like it's pretty flexible for how you want to use that and expand on it for playing the game and having fun.
Yeah, well, and for making the city feel like a lived-in place. Making NPCs that may not come back super often, but that you will see a couple of times throughout a couple of sessions and be like, oh, that's the guy, or like, oh, we're here in this district, and he lives here as well.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the physicality of the Spire. So it's this jumbo building that's sort of New York, but stacked on top of itself.
Exactly,
instead
yeah.
of spread out. are there buildings that surround it? You know, does everyone live in the spire and there's nothing around it except whatever barren waste or something?
So there are gates, so the Allied Defense Forces, the Aelfir Army, has a headquarters at the base of the spire. So I would say that for defensibility reasons, there's not a lot of buildings outside of the spire,
Okay.
and there certainly aren't a lot of drow on the surface.
Right, because they can't see.
And yeah, the spire extends pretty deep into the earth as well, and there are tunnels that lead to the drow home nations. And so, I would say any significant population that existed outside of the bounds of the spire, legally speaking, are probably small farmers and peasants and criminals who live in the tunnels underneath.
Okay. I guess that's another question I had, is how do people get food for such a concentrated urban environment?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's kind of hand-wavy. It's kind of... We know this. We know our ecologies don't actually work, but don't think about it too hard.
Okay.
There is a garden district where canonically the food of the spire is grown, and it's mostly mushrooms, algae, heavy nutrient dense proteins. There are crawfish farmers. There's also limited imports and smuggling from the home nations that happens through the tunnels.
All right. Well, makes more sense than Blades in the Dark setting.
It could be worse. The garden district is really fascinating, and it kind of on my side of the spire, as the spire is a living thing because people believe it to be, that the garden district especially tends to fluctuate in size, and it tends to be as there's always a kind of hedge of overgrown wilderness that blocks the sun from most of the glass windows that canonically extend throughout the garden district.
Okay.
These huge bubbles. And so no matter how deeply the workers cut into these hedges and force arable ground from them, there's always more hedge.
Okay, and those are the things that are making it so dark elves can be in that environment.
Exactly. Yeah. And also have enough sunlight so that some normal plants can grow there. Although
Right.
if you want there are some quote-unquote vanity crops that are grown with enchanted sun lamps and wheat and stuff for specifically Aelfir diets.
Okay. And I guess the other question I have is the aesthetics of the entire environment. This feels like it's sort of gothic horror-esque setting. Is that where you feel like it is, physically, for the architecture?
I've actually felt it to be much more industrialized. So
Okay.
I mean, there are elevators, there are guns, there are printing presses. So I have always pictured more 1920s, early 1900s.
Okay. So everyone's wearing those newspaper cap kind of things, or
Exactly,
big
yeah.
poofy dresses, or is it more flapper style?
So I think the Drow society is very much more flapper, but of course Aelfir are in a realm in and of themselves and tend to be more modernist, and some individuals might be if they consider themselves traditionalists, they'll be more Art Deco.
Okay.
But mostly surrealism is a big thing with them, and the Aelfir aesthetic is nature is great, but we can improve on it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I can see that. That is unusual for elves, because usually elves are kind of living with nature is the conception for them.
Yeah, so that's the big thing with the Aelfir, is that they're very self-obsessed, but they would consider themselves to be naturalists for sure. But there is not a thing that exists on this world that couldn't be improved by a high elf modifying it.
Oh, of course.
Because they're so beautiful and important, and they're bringing that beauty into the world, which is their sacred task. So,
Right.
which leads with the modern technology to really very body horror-esque. I would say, although the Aelfir aesthetic is very bright and glittering, especially because they tend to prefer ice sculptures and sub-zero temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
very much more the gothic horror, but if it was well lit and you could see everything that was awful about it.
Yeah. Yeah, the sub-zero temperatures was an odd thing that I wasn't expecting.
So the Aelfir are from the frozen north, and there's this really interesting thing where they originally invaded Spire, and they still, like, if you are a traditionalist, you'll take an ice bath every day, even in your, like, sub-zero house, just to maintain the kind of chill that Aelfir are naturally accustomed to. And it is said that Aelfir who forego these traditional baths are actually much crueler and more ill-tempered, more manic. They're really not meant to live in temperate environments. There's also like a subsection where their queen is like an eternal ice queen from the north who has a hive mind, and she doesn't really like the fact that she can no longer talk to the Aelfir of the Spire.
I thought it, like, it's this idea that, like, the Aelfir are these, cold-hearted bastards or something like that, and then it just, like, goes full into it, like, just physically as well.
There's no subtlety here.
Right. Well, I think the other cool thing about the Spire culture that we kind of missed here was the masks. You want to talk about that?
Yes. So the other really high point of Aelfir culture is that they will never be seen without a mask on. Really rich Aelfir will never be seen in the same mask twice. But every Aelfir has a true mask that they keep on their person, visible somewhere at all times. And there's a kind of thriving mask forgery culture where, because Aelfir and Drow are not too dissimilar physically, if a Drow was able to steal a true mask of an Aelfir and dispose of the original, they could theoretically take on the identity of this Aelfir without changing anything else about them, because in Aelfir society, if you have a true mask, you literally are that person. So you could be 3 inches shorter and have a much deeper voice, but as long as you have that true mask on, Aelfir are forced to interact with you as if you are the person.
How does, like, because the mask isn't covering, like, their hands, for example, would they still have to pretend if they see someone who has, dark elf hands, or would they?
You probably will get the guards called on you afterward. But while you are speaking to that person, you are legally the person who you disposed of.
Okay, so it's kind of like a signature, like you can have someone else, like, sign your name for you, and that's legal if you give them permission to do it.
Yes.
So they don't know if you have permission or not, so they're going to have to assume that you do.
Yeah, and there's this very fun, it's a point of Aelfir culture where, like, manners are civility is much more important than reality. Mm-hmm. So they would never say to your face that you are not the same person that they were talking to with this mask yesterday. Oh my god, that would be so gauche.
Oh yeah,
it's very much the Victorian, politeness is everything. If you make a misstep socially, you're dead. But Aelfir also stand very highly upon their dignity, and as far as hierarchy goes among them, they tend to have very obscure, complex titles that they expect everyone else to memorize, because it is death of a society, a party, to know that you are speaking out of turn to someone of higher rank than you. But if you're not quite sure if that lord over there, everyone's a lord, but if you're not quite sure that he's higher rank than you, then you can plead ignorance as long as you have his title memorized.
Ah, okay. This is feeling very, like, inspired by Roman culture almost, because they have the mask thing, not for living people, but for dead people. And an obsession with etiquette and dignity also feels like that was part of upper class Roman stuff.
Yeah, I think it is. They're pulling from a lot of different societies and pressing on sore points to try and create places where player characters can have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all taken to like the most extremes in order to make it very fragile and brittle. And so when a player character comes in and says, well, I have this mask, I'm going to be disguised as an Aelfir, and, you know, make all these moves at this party, no one would dare to turn them away from the party because that would be rude. In which case, the player who went to the work of creating a barely passable disguise now has all of this power as long as they obey these very specific and arcane rules.
Right, so if they trip up because they don't know those rules, that becomes the problem instead of just getting them
and they get pounced upon.
It almost feels like it might be bad for the person that you've taken the mask from to admit that they lost their mask, because that itself is a huge embarrassment.
Absolutely. They would, yeah. I mean, they would probably send assassins after you, but they would just kind of stay secluded in their mansion for a few days.
Right. It's so embarrassing. I have to kill this person who stole my mask.
No one can ever find out that I had to kill this person. They're so far beneath me in station.
Okay. I think that's a pretty good overlook at the sort of canon version, and like you said, your specific focus was more on the gods. So let's get into the gods within your version of the campaign.
Yeah. So we haven't talked about any of the death gods yet. So I want to mention there are two big ones in the Spire. There is Charnel, who is the hyena god. And this is kind of where it's like, oh yeah, we're taking inspiration from the gnolls, but we're removing the gnolls from the context. So in the Charnel religion, or the Charnelites, you would ask your body to be eaten by sacred hyenas and vultures, very similar to the Towers of Silence. And in fact, there are those towers do exist in New Heaven, the uppermost district on the roof of Spire.
Uh-huh.
And so that's you can play as a carrion priest with a hyena as a companion, and you have one of your moves is to remove rot and disease from food to make it whole again. But you can also literally eat people and gain their memories. There's a lot of cannibalism in this game.
Oh boy.
And the other big death god, kind of in the opposite direction, is Meror, the god of snuffed candles. And he runs a very powerful guild called the Morticians, who can perform what's known as undying surgery, where they remove your heart and replace it with a relic. And you will go on and on and on. You've become a lich, basically.
Okay.
And your heart in a jar of dirt is your physical reliquary or phylactery.
Uh-huh.
And whomsoever controls that heart controls you. So there are some Aelfir who insist all of their bodyguards become undying and then control their hearts.
Is this like a compulsion control, or more like, if you don't do what I tell you, I'm going to stab your heart in this jar and then you'll be dead?
It is a compulsion. So, and the definition of control is kind of nebulous. So if a drow minister picked up a heart but was still within an Aelfir's house and surrounded by undying soldiers, it's okay, well, maybe I'll smash your heart, but do you really control this heart even though you're within our power, kind of thing.
Okay. So it is sort of some nebulous fairy rule for how that works.
Exactly.
Okay. I mean, maybe that's the best, because then it can be whatever,
whatever the story needs it to be. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
And so there's those two death gods. There is Ishkra the spider goddess. There's also the triumvirate moon goddess of the drow. So there is a full moon, a dark moon, and a red moon aspect of the moon goddess.
Okay, not specifically blood moon like that part, but red?
Yes. So In my version of the Spire, the red moon happens much more regularly. It's called the Hunter's Moon.
Okay.
And it's more like, it's not like a lunar eclipse, but it's more like, yeah, every couple of months we'll have a red moon instead of a regular full moon.
Okay. I mean, they happen that oftenly on Earth, just not in the same place. Whatever. It's magic. We don't have to worry about it.
It's magic. Who cares? Someone tried to make me do orbital mechanics to explain the moon stuff, and I was like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, it's not worth the time.
It works because it works. It's magic.
Yeah.
And there is also the solar pantheon of the Aelfir. So there is Father Summer, Mother Winter, Sister Spring, and Brother Autumn. And the main characters, as part of the plot, begin the game as ministers or priests in service to the dark side of the moon. Lombre, the goddess of secrecy and grace. And so it was a really easy kind of lead-in for me to be like, okay, well, you're working for this goddess, and she wants you to do something specific. I threw in like some early tension there. One of the first missions they went on was to an isolated community in the Garden District where worship of the Triumvirate was very different. Because in the Spire, the red moon and the dark moon goddess have been banned. Only worship of the full moon is allowed, because that's the kind of like sanitized version. Her values are like community and resilience. So her priests are very much like, buckle down, we can take it. We don't need to make any overt actions, but we're just going to survive this and get through this by taking care of each other. Whereas the red moon is the goddess of fury. And yeah, so they don't really like having her priests around. And the dark moon is the goddess of spies and assassinations. So yes. Also not great for them.
Okay, so that's part of their system of control, is to outlaw these more subversive aspects of dark elf faith.
Yeah. And I mean, for original dark elf culture, it's not necessarily out of place for you to seek formal combat as a redress for some wrong through the offices of the Blood Moon. But that's not possible when you have a ruling class who are above the law. And so their laws specifically exclude any version of that.
I guess one thing I was thinking about for these, well, two things, I guess. One of them is that it feels like you have explicit death gods, but not like explicit life gods. Is that true?
Well, that's so not quite, because there is Ishkra the spider goddess. So the midwives in Spire it's a very literal title. In this world, Drow do not give live birth. They kind of weirdly marsupial, like a half-assed marsupial, they'll lay an egg sac with a unformed fetus that is then fed blood in these hatcheries by these midwives.
Okay.
And so there's this whole traditional culture around like getting high vintage blood for your child. But the continuation of the Drow race would literally not be possible without the intervention of the midwives.
Okay. That was not what I was expecting.
So she's the closest that we have to a life goddess. And then there are some other, like, older, forgotten gods who deal more explicitly with life and death, like, as one aspect instead of split into separate things.
Mm-hmm. The second thing I was curious about is you mentioned, like, dark elf gods are the moon ones, and we have the solar pantheon for the Aelfir, and you had the Charnel for the Gnolls. And what about the humans? Do they have any gods, or just none that are relevant?
None that are relevant at the moment. So the humans tend more towards pragmatism, and they call them the Wandering Kings, which are basically the tall tales, the folk tales, the Paul Bunyans of the world.
Right.
So people that may have once been real, but are no longer real and have advanced to it like another mythos.
Okay. So kind of like how the Chinese pantheon has a bunch of.
Yeah, people like historical figures. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's very much a human thing. Like the Drow do have saints, which they call hallows. And a hallow will sometimes get reincarnated.
Ooh.
So if you perform a act of like extreme faith to whatever aspect of the moon that you are attuned to, you can be continually reborn. But the hallows tend to be very subversive as well, because a lot of them are like, yes, you rose from the dead and saved all of these other people from the Aelfir battle that was happening. We're not going to think about that too much.
Right, yeah.
Worship of the Hallows is officially banned in Spire, but much less stringently than some of the other sub-religions.
Yeah, I would also think like reincarnations from, if it's a real thing, of people that lived before the Aelfir were here would be bad. It feels like an obvious rallying point for rebellion.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the pre-written missions that you can go on is someone is claiming to be a Hallow and you want to get to her before everyone else in the Spire does. For various other reasons. She is very valuable to a lot of factions.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those are really the relevant gods.
Yeah, you said there was like 100 on the Parishioner's Way.
Pilgrim's Walk, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they like Pilgrim's Walk gods come and go pretty quickly. There is one of the classes is called a gutter cleric, where you literally stuff your pockets with holy symbols and pray to each one after the other to wait until one of them gives you a miracle.
Like Benny and the Mummy.
Yes. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But so there are a lot of gods in there that like specifically for that class that are more or less relevant to the main gods.
But it feels like you could just kind of make up whatever you wanted in that circumstance.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes there's something relevant, and sometimes there isn't.
Okay, all right. I think I've got a pretty good view of the setting. You want to talk about your campaign in more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, we started off as ministers of our hidden mistress, which is classic, which is mandatory for the game. But from there, I kind of went into the occult religion because I've got all the stuff on the back burner, the big picture stuff about the gods seeking control of the Spire in order to control this magical lightning rod that's about to happen. And I've also got this one character who came back to life, who is a servant of the Spire itself, willingly or unwillingly. And that character also is brought back to life kind of violently. The Spire basically says, "You're going to do what I want you to do," and then goes silent for several months. And it's like, okay, well, you're wandering around, and that's fine for now.
Well, this is one of the players, or
Yes, yeah. So we've got the players were a firebrand, a knight, a idol, and an inksmith. And it was the firebrand who are very classic rabble rouser type characters.
You're saying past tense because they're dead, or
they're dead, yeah. Actually, they were dead. They're not being played in the campaign anymore, but they're not permanent. They're not hard killed.
Okay.
And so their job was to pay attention to the interests of the living spire, which the living spire is seeking to also harness this magical event to become alive physically.
Okay.
In a way that it is believed to be, but again, because belief is so ephemeral, the gods are seeking literal immortality. And not just immortality, but awareness of being. Because, a rock could be immortal, but it doesn't know that it's a rock.
Right. So this is more like I'm thinking of like a building that's alive, kind of like in Encanto for the Disney movie, where the house
Yes,
like
but evil.
yeah.
And doesn't even necessarily hate the people that live there, but doesn't also care about them.
Yeah, like you said, they're like ants inside of it.
Exactly. So we start seeing, we start peeling back the layers of saying, okay, well, these people worship the triple goddess differently. Why is that? And like, obviously the players are keyed into, well, we're going to follow these religious repression threads because we're experiencing this religious repression in the game. But also to be like, okay, well, it's not just repression. There's something literally magical going on in the fact that they are depriving these two facets of the moon goddess from worshippers, which means those facets are becoming less powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And later on in the game, in the Black Cove mission, where they go to this isolated town, they decide, well, we're going to save all of these children from the incoming Aelfir repression, and we're gonna like whisk them away to an orphanage and save at least these innocents from the rampages of the Aelfir.
Okay.
And I said, okay, that's great. And they managed to do so. A lot of hard rolls, a lot of narrative consequences. But then they got a lot of flack from their boss in the ministry, who was basically saying, hey, you had one objective, which was to bring me this one person from the town. I didn't ask for all of these children, and I don't know what to do with them. So, I need you guys to be, like, a little bit less heroic.
Feels so bad to hear that as a player.
I know, yeah. Well, it's like, well, you did this thing, and you managed to do this job, and you got away with it, but that wasn't what your boss wanted. And so I really wanted to play with, like, in some games, the ministry and the people in it are very nebulous. It's like, okay, well, this is this disconnected spy network. In some games, it's very put together, where it's like, well, these are the cells that are working here, here, and here. It's like much more like the CIA. In my game, it's very much a secret society, an Illuminati type thing, where you know that there are other people in there. You can maybe identify them with certain signs and signals, but if you don't listen to the superior above you, you get kicked really hard.
I feel like even within the Illuminati, there's different versions of it as well.
Yes, we love a secret society.
Yeah.
And as part of this, one of the idol, one of the other characters, had a vision through a device called a catastrophe altar.
Okay.
Which is something that the players can get a hold of for their safe house. It's one of the safe house moves that you can take. That it shows you the worst possible future. Literally, if everything goes bad, here is where you'll end up. And then mechanically, you can invoke that anytime later in the mission and say, okay, well, here's what I saw on the catastrophe altar, and here's how I avoid it.
Ah, okay. So it's kind of like a flashback mechanic, sort of?
It is, yeah. And because it is something that is sacred to Lombre, we also saw a vision of the goddess of the dark side of the moon. And because of the way heaven works for the Drow, there is literally a city on the dark side of the moon where once, adherents of the goddess lived very peacefully and silently.
Uh-huh.
No one lives there now, and she is lost and confused. She can't remember the names of her sisters. She doesn't know what she's doing there. So, she still exists, and she is still powerful within her own realm, but the loss of worshippers is driving her mad.
Oh, okay.
And so that is really the first overt play that move that the players see is okay, well, something is wrong with this particular goddess. How do we fix this?
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask. Do you fix it within Spire, or do you have to fix it physically? go there and show her where the city is.
Yeah, I mean there is a world in which they go to the moon, and there are ways to do that and get there, mostly dying, but
Oh yeah, guess that would work.
you can also get there through the heart. So if they went down into the heart and up through a portal to the moon, which may or may not be the real moon, it's kind of a pocket dimension, and like fixed it there, it was possible. What I did was kind of tie that in to this coming magical event. So it's like, well, you can't necessarily repair the fact that the goddess has no worshippers, that you can't make her be accepted in the Spire in the current political power structure. So you can either lean into the political side of it and try and like legitimize worship of her again, or you can try and rely on this nebulous magical event that you kind of think is coming. And so we went up Spire into the University of Divine Magic to raid the library there, which went so badly the first time that they tried it that one player retired, or one character retired, another one died, and the other guy had just started 3 sessions ago, so he barely.
I did have a thought before we get into the library raid. Was so the goddess is having all these issues because the Spire people aren't able to worship her, so she's like losing out on her prayers that feed her.
Yeah.
What about the rest? You mentioned like Drow, Dark Elf, home nations. What about all of those spaces?
Yes. So there, I mean, that is the reason that she is still quote unquote alive. That people still remember that she exists, that she still has her space on the moon, like she has this empty city that she rules over. And so the home nations, the reason the home nations haven't retaken the Spire is that they are currently embroiled in about 6 different civil wars. There was a ruling family called the Starris who were Targaryen levels of bad at ruling, and were fairly recently overthrown by all of the other noble houses. But then, of course, no one could decide who would be the rulers next. Everything descended into bloody civil war, and refugees from the home nations still regularly arrive in Spire.
Oh, okay. So stuff isn't going that well for the home nations either.
No. And there is no, I mean, there's scattered worship, but certainly no, like, organized, there's no papal seats available at the moment.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, back to the library raid that a bunch of people almost died on.
Everybody died in the library raid. They didn't even really make it to the library because the library is located in this high society place called Amaranth, and it's very difficult to get into for multiple reasons. The players decided to make it really complicated. And it did not go well for them. So I basically sat everybody down and I said, well, there's a bunch of different ways that you guys could go next. You're bringing in all these new characters. Do you still want to focus on the library, or do you want to bring the plot in a different direction? And they decided they wanted to go back to the library for round 2.
Woo!
Thank God, because I'd already done all of the world building for that.
Right.
I'd written 10 different books that they could find, and 8 different places in the library, depending on what they rolled and where they rolled it and what time of day they went in. And to make a long story short, they did much, much better the second time and made it out with concrete information about this magical event, and also some really ancient information about the last time that this event happened. So they kind of have the pieces that they need at this point in the campaign to enact this ritual to give their goddess control / physicality within the Spire. Really, there's a bunch of different ways it could go. One of the things that they could do was they could focus just on their goddess, on Lombre, to the detriment of the other 2 moon goddesses. and make just her real. Who knows what that would do to the fabric of the Spire. They could try and bring the whole triplicate together. They could try and like devote it to the Spire, the living Spire, which is what the druid guy wants to do. There's a lot of options, and I honestly don't know which one they're going to do, which is my favorite part about this game, is it's so light on prep work because I just don't know.
Well, yeah, that's pretty cool. You have a lot of interesting pieces floating around for what you're doing, but you'll get something that's satisfying and fun, kind of no matter where it goes.
Exactly. And whatever pieces don't end up getting used can get wrapped into a side story somewhere.
And you also said this is an actual play that you're doing, like a podcast version of it?
Yes, it is. So I just finished the rough episode edit of episode 23. That one is going to come out on May 10th. I release episodes every new moon.
Ooh. That's good. Her Dark Ministrations. All right. Yeah, we'll put a link for that in the podcast description episode thing for it as well.
And I am hopeful. I've been seeing a couple of other people dip their toes into Spire actual plays. I really got started in this game. You know, it had been on my periphery for a long time, but Rusty Quill Gaming did a special. There's like 3 episodes run by Grant Howitt, one of the writers of the game. And it is absolutely delightful. Full chaos energy. They blow up a building at the end just because.
That sounds fun. Now, is there anything you wanted to touch on or talk about that we didn't get to yet?
Well, so I suppose I can go into kind of some of the side occultists of Spire.
Sure.
One of my favorite are the Blood Witches, which are infected by a kind of virus that turns them from people into quote-unquote zootropic horrors. And so they can kind of shed their drow or human skin and like take on this horrific form. They can also like make animal familiars by feeding them infected blood, and have all sorts of like fortune telling and future telling potentials just by tasting someone's blood or like tracking them. Curses are one of their specialties.
Gotta have that cannibalism in one way or another for each of the magics.
Oh yeah, for sure. Speaking of cannibalism, if you do too much cannibalism and it isn't sanctioned by a god, that's how you become a ghoul.
Oh.
And there's a king of ghouls who rules down in Derelictus, and his name is King Teeth.
Of course it is.
We haven't talked nearly as much about the lower society of Spire. And so it kind of goes like there's the upper society, there's Amaranth, there's the middle city, there's the Garden District. Below the Garden District is the Works, which is the industrial sector. And there's also a thriving, there's 2 ports on the ground level. There are 2 rivers, the River Alf and the River Zeph, each of which are ruled over by a different merchant faction.
Okay.
And then below that is Red Row, which is a really fascinating kind of like slum that's ruled over by like 3 or 4 different gangsters, including the Threadneedle Sisters, which are the drug runners of Spire. There's Mr. Winters, the main gun runner. And beneath that, there is Derelictus, which is the last level before the Heart. And that's where all of the riffraff end up. It is the least supported area of Spire. The roads are ramshackle. There's a lively smuggling trade from the home nations that has its roots in Derelictus. And everybody's kind of on their own there. As much as I love high society, I find myself much more interested generally in the low society, areas just because the Aelfir are very difficult to play. It's this kind of like weird, okay, this makes sense to them in their rules and their like fairy magic.
Yeah, too alien though.
Yeah, but I definitely I understand where a gangster is coming from. I understand what the mobster who tried to mug you and realized it was a really bad idea ended up.
Yeah, I guess as long as you can contextualize like the magic and cannibalistic and the sort of the heart evil hell space underneath the spire.
Yes, yeah. Well, the heart, I mean, because of the Vermissian, runs its fingers. The lines of the Vermissian are literally called artery and vein lines. Runs its corruption throughout the city, but it is most felt in Derelictus for sure. And there are people, if you want to play Heart, you can visit Derelictus. That's kind of the uppermost level that you get to. Because reality starts to break down. And there are things in the heart that live only because the heart wants it to.
Oh.
So there are like skinless horrors and stuff that if they stepped foot in a place that was real, would instantly perish and shrivel. But because of the energies and the magic of the heart, they manage to survive and thrive within whatever levels they manage to reach.
Yeah, that's really interesting, like having a monster like that just kind of sort of can't exist in the real world.
Yeah, and to make it fairly easy to get to your hell dimension.
Yeah.
And the question of whether or not your hell dimension is really another dimension at all.
Yeah, I can almost imagine like some sort of ghost that's able to influence through the veins of the Vermissian. So the way to kill it isn't really to go and shoot it with a pistol or exercise it. It's more like you have to pull it into the real world and then it instantly dies. That's a really cool way of handling that type of monster.
Yeah. And I really like playing with that liminal space in Spire. It's like, okay, well, here are things that are real, and some things like the Inksmith, but even like the Inksmith and stuff, it's like, okay, well, this is going to obey the laws of physics. You're a hard-boiled journalist, and you're writing pieces for the masses. You're writing mass-produced pieces. You're writing about the guy down the street who just got elected to alderman. But you're also literally influencing reality. There's the Inksmith has a move that's like everyone's favorite move in the game. It's called Man with a Gun. You say you're invoking this move, and a man with a gun walks, non-gender specific, walks into the room. You have no say over who they are, what kind of gun they have, or whose side they're on. The GM decides all of that, but you can create more chaos instantly just by marking some stress.
That's it's like some dime novel power there. Like
Yes, absolutely.
invoke melodrama.
Yes, that's their whole thing. So I love the kind of mix between reality and unreality. And then there's the demons on top of it. So, we're talking about the heart and heart's unreality, but like in my version of the Spire, the demons are hyper real and they obey very specific laws of physics, which is why the gnolls were able to capture and control them and use them to power their engines. So even though that Drow and Aelfir society doesn't understand what those rules are, and in demonic incursions inevitably lead to this kind of mass destruction, doesn't mean those rules aren't there. Whereas in the heart, there are no rules, it's just vibes.
Right. Or there are rules, it's just we can't understand them.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think that's kind of it. I am really excited for the next episode of my podcast. 23, we're going to introduce 2 new player characters. One previously hard killed, and another one has gone off to do a side quest, but will be coming back. So we've got a couple of new people in that I'm very excited for people to meet.
All right, cool. Well, usually I have people give any advice for DMing, GMing to others that they want to shout out. So do you have anything you want to say for that?
Oh gosh. In the next 5 seconds, do something that you as the GM are interested in. I have killed myself for games before that everyone else loved and that I hated. So really, like, you as the GM are a player. You deserve to have fun at the table too. If the game that you're playing or the setting that you're using just isn't interesting to you, that's like, you can sit down with your players and say, hey, I want to play a Weird West game, or hey, I want to play a Blades of the Dark game, but using, I whatever setting you and whatever mechanics that you find fascinating, make sure you get your group's approval, but you need to play a game that you are liking. So that is my number one suggestion. Don't kill yourself for a game or a setting that you are not excited about.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Yeah, it's hard to keep the passion going for something that you're not passionate about.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for coming on the show, Maura. It was great having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I am really excited to listen to some more episodes of your podcast.
Thank you.
Quick reminder that I'm looking for people to go on the show, so if you or someone you know would be interested, please direct yourself or them to gocorral.com/STS for instructions on how to become a guest on Setting the Stage. That's GOCORRAL.com/STS. Thank you.